So as Katie said, my name's Joey. I'm joined by Mike and together with the Lost Peatlands Project Ecologists. And today we're going to be running through about an hour-long talk on the natural history of the peatlands of South Wales. So we're going to be covering a bit of a background to our project, the Lost Peatlands Project, and then we're also going to run through what is a peatland and how does it form with some specific examples from South Wales. And then we're going to be covering the kind of characteristic plants and animals that you'd find in a peatland. And then we'll give a brief run through of some peat restoration at the end. If you have questions that come up as we go through it, you can submit them via Twitter to us, either myself or Mike or the Lost Peatlands project account will work well. So the Lost Peatlands project is a Heritage Lottery funded project. We focus on upland habitat restoration, peatland restoration, as you can probably tell. We're in a 1-year development phase at the moment, and then from 2021 through 2025, we'll be in our delivery phase, where we're actually going to be delivering on our peatland restoration that we're planning at the moment. So this is just a map of our project area, and I'll hand over to Mike to talk a bit about some of our areas.
Okay, thanks, Joey. Yeah, so this is a map of the broad project area with the kind of purplish outline covering the Lost Peatlands project area. And within that, you can see a number of different sites. So the ones with the acronym HRA after them, they are habitat restoration areas. So they are the areas focused for peatland restoration. So there's Cregan HRA above Rhyncorwg over in the Corwg Valley, then just off the Avon, and then there's Cymru HRA, which is above Trwy, just off the Rhondda Valley, and then Castell Nos HRA in the east of the project area, above Mae'r and above Mae'r Reservoir there. Then there's another number of sites, the CWS sites. These are community wild spaces, and these are smaller sites, usually, well, mainly focused at public engagement type things. And then the big red bordered area there is the Peatlands wind farm habitat restoration area. And this is a large scale habitat restoration program associated with the wind farm development.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So just to run through what is a peatland, and it's next to impossible to answer that question without also defining peat. And peat is a type of soil. It's this really dark, almost black soil that you can see on the right-hand picture here. And it's formed of semi-decomposed matter. And over time, these soils accumulate up to the depths of tens of meters. And then where these soils accumulate, that's what we call a peatland. Now they form where the rainfall into the system exceeds the loss of water out of the system. And this leads to a near constant saturation of the soil. And changes to the movement of water and the storage of water can change the function of the ecosystem and change the rate of accumulation of the peat. But to be defined as peat, there has to be a minimum depth of 30 centimetres and the minimum organic content of around 30%. And within a British context, we have 3 broad habitat categories, and these are going to be blanket bog, also known as blanket mire, and then we've got raised bog and fen as well. So I'll just run through a couple of definitions for these. So fens are formed in a depression, and it's a peatland that's influenced by surface water and groundwater. And they can be either acidic or alkaline and have a variable nutrient availability within them. Where peat accumulates to a level where the surface runoff and groundwater can't affect that central area of the peat, you get a raised bog, named after their domed shape that you can see in the middle picture here. These are the peatlands which will be the deepest. They can be up to tens of meters, and they're solely influenced by rainwater within the central raised area. They tend to be highly acidic and they have a really low nutrient content. Where you get a cool climate and heavy rainfall, like South Wales, you would expect to find a blanket bog. These tend to be a shallower peat over a large area, and they can have a range of characteristics. Usually you would end up with a mosaic or kind of a complex of kind of fen-like peat in lower areas, in the valleys and depressions, and then on the summit you would get summit mires, which tend to be more acidic and low nutrient. So peatlands only occupy a very small percentage of the global landmass. It's about 3%, but they're of a really high global significance for a range of roles. They're really important for carbon sequestration, so that's carbon capture and storage. And they also perform ecosystem services surrounding fire prevention and flood prevention. They're the largest terrestrial carbon store, with around about 30% of the global soil carbon stored in them. And yearly, they sequester about 0.37 gigatons of carbon, which is more than all the other vegetation types in the world combined. And while we see pristine peatland being a carbon sink, when you get a degraded peatland, these can actually act as a net carbon source. This diagram on the right from the IUCN, you can see some of the effects of draining a peatland and causing damage to the habitat. And this includes things like biodiversity loss and greenhouse gas emissions, as well as increased fire and flood risk. In Europe, this was from the IUCN in 2016, there was a loss of about 2 billion tonnes of carbon per year from damaged peatlands. In Europe, that accounts for around 6% of the global land area. And globally, damaged peatlands account for around 6% of all carbon emissions. Within the UK, there's also a significance to peatlands. The UK blanket bog habitat accounts for about 13% of the global blanket bog habitat, which, if you remember, blanket bog forms with cool temperatures and high rainfall leading to saturated land. Peatlands are the largest area of semi-natural vegetation in the UK. There's about 2.5 million hectares, and that's around 10% of the total UK landmass. Within Wales, it's about 5.6%. And within the UK, there's a total carbon content within our peatland habitats stored that's estimated to be around 2,300 megatons. And 1 megaton is 1 billion kilos. So there's a lot of carbon that's stored within these habitats. So peat formation occurs due to the slow decomposition of plant material within the habitat. It's incomplete decomposition. And that decomposition is incomplete because it's inhibited due to the low oxygen levels and the acidic nature of the habitat, and also the high water levels. Everything is very waterlogged all the time. And peat accumulation can exhibit changes depending on a range of things. Hydrology, the water table within the peat body itself, topology, whether or not you're in a valley fen, kind of a depression as you see below, or a raised bog when you get surface water running off the habitat. As well as the difference in floral communities that you see, we'll cover that a bit later, and the level of disturbance within the peatland habitat. So I'm going to hand over to Mike, and he's going to talk a bit about the paleo-ecological evidence that we can get from peatlands.
Okay, thanks, Joey. Yeah, so Joey's gone through how peat forms and how water is kind of crucial to that process through inhibited decomposition of plant material. But what I'm going to talk through now a little bit is how some of the evidence from the South Wales region tells us how peat actually formed in the South Wales uplands. So evidence for this generally comes from paleo-ecological work, looking at pollen from either peat cores or from historic sites, such as burial mounds. And this is scientific work looking at the pollen found in these deposits, identifying that pollen, so you can identify most pollen species. And then looking at the volume of that pollen that's present, and using dating methods, carbon dating, to build up a picture of what plant species were around when and in what kind of relative abundances. So this means to build up pictures of the habitat and how the habitat time. And it's crucial to know that the South Wales region was glaciated during the Pleistocene period, so approximately 18,000 years ago. Developed from the Brecon Beacons in the Carmarthen Fans area, spread southwards through the South Wales region until they hit the Pennant Escarpment around Craigellyn, basically around the South Wales Lost Peatland region, and were deflected. And then this main upland area around the heads of the valleys give rise to its own ice sheet. And these ice flows developed in the cums, such as Cwm Cybran, Cwm Park, and flowed southwards through the valleys, cut in the Rhondda Valley, the Avon Valley, and the other valleys in the area. So this pollen analysis we do only really tell us about the habitat development and the plant species presence post glaciation. But this is this is a story of how the landscape has developed through time from that point, and it really is a story of people and the landscape. So when we look at how the landscape and the habitats have changed through time, it's been heavily influenced by people. So you look at the historic evidence of people in the region goes back as far as the Mesolithic period, so around 10,000 years ago. So you find a material such as flints and cores and blades and flakes, and evidence of charcoal in some of the sites. So evidence of burning and taking of trees out. And it's considered, it's most likely the human activity during the Mesolithic in this area. So, immediately well, not immediately, but very recently post-glaciation, so 10,000 to 8,000 years ago, it's probably dominated by hunter-gatherer groups on a seasonal kind of migration pattern through the area. These groups were clearing trees and starting to change the way the landscape looked and change how the landscape developed. So yeah, thanks, Joey. So if we just go on to the next slide now. So when we look at this paleo-ecological evidence and look at how the pollen has changed and how habitats have changed through time, I think you've gone one slide too far, Joey.
Yeah, sorry, but there we go.
Yeah, no worries. So we look at from around 12,000 years ago, the tundra vegetation emerged immediately post-glaciation, slowly changed and was colonized by birch and Scots pine. And then we had a warm period around 8,500 years ago, and that changed to a woodland dominated by oak and elm and hazel woodland. And this is in the areas, and now we've got peatland. So, the peatland has developed since this kind of period. So this is varied by topography in the areas you look at. So some of the valley fens and Mae'rs around the Craigellyn, these show a whole sequence of vegetation, and therefore the peat was forming from around about 10,000 years ago. Whereas in some of the shallower areas of blanket peat, the picture is a much more recent thing, from about 4,000 maybe years ago and to even more recent. And it's likely that these habitats, especially in the blanket bog, were probably a combination of changes in the climate, so a move to the more Atlantic climate from about 4,000 years ago, more oceanic conditions, but also a change to habitat management or impacts of humans on the landscape through increased tree felling and clearance to facilitate probably seasonal grazing. So when we look at peat cores from local raised bogs such as Hirwaun or valley Mae'r such as Craigellyn, this is the kind of picture that emerges with the post-glacial vegetation changes to really, by the end of the Bronze Age, a heathy habitat, a peat, heathy dominated landscape with isolated pockets of oak woodland. And that's the kind of the generally accepted picture of what the landscape was looking at that kind of period. So initial peat formation would have probably been confined to shallow lakes and wet hollows in the landscape. With over time these infilling and the lakes disappearing and the open water become fen and acid peat, and then these spreading out across the landscape to form blanket bog habitat that really dominated the landscape from then on. One of the main causes of this might have been paludification, which is caused by when you move the trees. And you can see a kind of graphic of this in the top right of the screen, where you move the trees and then the rainfall causes leaching through the soil, and then this leaches and pulls out minerals to cause a hard surface to form lower down in the soil horizon. And that inhibits water movement through the soil and increases saturation, which we know from Joey's summary earlier on, reduces the decomposition and causes peat formation. And a kind of great example of this is some of the finds from Mardy Wind Farm. We look at the lower right image there, showing a 6,000-year-old oak post decorated with oval patterns and zigzag lines and carving that was found during some historic excavation work on the site prior to wind farm development. And this is about 6,000 years old. So this was found deep down, towards the base of the peat. So a really interesting find showing that, the peat is a really post-human development. Yeah, so the use of the peatland system, and peat has a real long history of usage for fuel, farming, horticulture, and more recently forestry. And each of these uses has left marks on the landscape and changed the habitat structure and composition, and modifying the communities that would have been present to what we see today. And many of these changes have interfered with the function of the ecosystem, and changed the nature of the peat and led to erosion of the peat in some cases, and in other cases led to the accretion of peat that we've seen with some of the early felling, and now more recently with wind farm development as well. So if we go on to the next slide again, we can see some historic images of our region there. So the outline boundary there is the same as we showed you in one of the early slides. And the left-hand image is the 1945 aerial, so immediately post-war or during the war aerial of the region. And you can see the upland plateau and Mae'r Reservoir in the top right there. And you can see that there's no forestry on site. And this landscape probably remains fairly unchanged from the end of the Bronze Age, really through to this kind of time period. I mean, it's too wet for crops. People would never really grown crops up there, and it really was used as pasture for millennia. You know, this network of old walls and enclosures up there that really tell us the story of the pastoral upland land use of the region. Cattle and sheep grazing probably modified the habitats to some extent and created a kind of mosaic of open peatlands and heaths and acid grassland. There's some writing on how the landscape looked prior to this from the 18th century, with I think the region referred to as the Alps of Glamorgan in some of the 19th century writings. I mean, this obviously really changed fundamentally in the early 19th century with the development of coal mining and the exploitation of the valleys and the vast influxes of people. But it didn't really change the upland land use that much. You know, the development and the coal mining industry was really constrained to the valley floors, just because of the ease of access to the coal. The only potential changes were slight increases in public access and use of the areas for recreation. And then if we look at the right-hand image, this is approximately 25 years later, I think, so 1960s image of the region. And you can see this is the start of the afforestation of the area. And this was really driven by policy, really. There was a lot of concern about the lack of home-produced wood following, you know, U-boat blockades during the war, and the estimated future pit prop demand, and this really led to the drive for a kind of industrialization of the upland landscape in this area, with the planting of conifer forestry across vast areas. So this image shows that the forestry is fairly well advanced down in the bottom left of the image, which is the Avon Forest Park region, but hasn't quite reached the top of the area, right in the far north there around Craigellyn. And this afforestation crept across the region over the next probably 20 years, with the whole area being under trees by the 1980s. I mean, now most of this forestry has been removed for various reasons, with large dieback and some of the wind farm development. And really, when you go up there now, the landscape is starting to reveal itself again to be what it perhaps once looked like. And one of the major drivers of this was some Welsh Government legislation or policy that advocated the development of wind farms on Welsh Government land, or TAN 8 in the 2000s. And the Losgate Peatlands Landscape and Project really originated in one of these wind farm developments, the Peatlands wind farm development in our area. So if we go on to the next slide now, we can look at how the landscape is looking now following wind farm development. And this is a video produced by Vattenfall, showing the turbines obviously in the landscape, but also you can see the upland plateau. It's a really rather large level area above the valleys, and this is interspersed with now open areas where the trees have either failed due to the peat depths present, or been cleared to allow the turbine development. Hopefully that's playing okay for you. So this removal of trees now is really giving us an opportunity to not only see the landscape, but potentially restore areas of deep peat within the landscape to a better ecological condition, I suppose. So re-wet them and help store the carbon. And the Peatlands is one of the biggest wind farms in the UK. I think when it was built, it was probably the biggest in England or Wales. There's around 76 turbines in the area, producing 228 megawatts of electricity, so it probably supply about 50% of Wales's electricity at any point in time. So that's really brought us up to date with the land use of the area. So I think I'll hand over back to Joey now to talk about some peatland community stuff.
Thanks, Mike. So when we talk about peatland communities, the biodiversity that we find in the areas, they've got a number of really rare or threatened or just declining habitats and species. With some of the plant assemblies that we find, they're better represented in the UK than anywhere else in the world. And a significant number of the peatland communities and habitats that we find in Wales and in the UK, they're really considered to be of a European importance. So the species that we've got here, we've got cotton grass on the far left, and then water vole. Then we've got Sphagnum capillifolium, and then Drosera on the far right. So peatland flora, it needs to be able to survive the really harsh conditions that you find in the peatland mire habitats. And these are, really waterlogged, low oxygen soil, low nutrient availability, and you get a really extreme acidic environment as well. An active bog, which is bog in good condition, is characterized by a really high bryophytic abundance. So this is mosses and liverworts, especially the sphagnum, with a range of grasses and sedges and dwarf shrubs like heather as well. Now, these two pictures that are on this slide, they kind of serve to illustrate the benefit of looking very closely at the peatland habitat. So on the one on the left, which is a real close-up of the ground level mosses, we've got a nice diversity of sphagnum here, with some heather and a couple of other dwarf shrubs as well. And then this pale grey blue is lichen. And then if you look at the image on the right, this square is 25 centimetres by 25 centimetres, just to give you an idea of scale. And then the lighter patches that we can see within the darker patches, the lighter patches of the sphagnum moss, so you can really see kind of the dominance of this. Now the habitat that we find within the peatlands kind of grades into other associated habitats, wet, dry, heathland, things like that. But the high water table and vegetation cover is what provides that key ecosystem service of peat accumulation and carbon storage. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sphagnum, and sphagnum mosses are the key peat forming species within the system. They're able to hold an incredible amount of water, and they exhibit a really long decomposition time, which helps with the peat accumulation. They kind of average around 1 millimetre of peat accumulation per year. If we look at this image on the right, this is Sphagnum fimbriatum, and you can see going from top to bottom, you have the capitulum, which is at the top. This is the active growing centre of the sphagnum. If you compare this to grasses, where the active growing centre is at the bottom, it means that the sphagnum is able to kind of grow up continually while it simultaneously decays at the bottom. And this is what allows it to contribute so much to the carbon storage and be the main component of peat accumulation, alongside its ability to store vast amounts of water. There are around 36 species of sphagnum in the UK. There's been a couple of divisions within species within the past couple of years. And they grow in a variety of forms. So within a British context, you tend to get carpets of sphagnum, hummocks of sphagnum, which are slightly raised above the level of the rest of vegetation, and then hollows, which are slightly below it, and they tend to be submerged in the water. And this creates a kind of a varied microtopography within the landscape. And the different species create this topography depending on their preference for the level of water, and different species occupying different niches. You can use that then to help assess the condition of the habitat that you're looking at, and kind of the conditions that you would find within it. So I've got 3 pictures here. I'm just going to run through quite quickly. So on the left here, we have Sphagnum squarosum. It's very green with a kind of hooked branch leaf on the top, which you should be able to see in some of them. I think the pictures come out quite clearly. So this tends to thrive in habitats which are less acidic and with a higher nutrient availability. And it's also able to deal with lower moisture. So what we've seen on some of our sites is where you get areas which are kind of more of a wet woodland dominated by willow. You can still find this growing where the water level is more variable and lower than in a central peat area. In the middle, this is actually a mixed hummock of 2 types of sphagnum. This picture was taken on Whiteley Wind Farm in Scotland, quite close to Glasgow. And you've got a fat chunky one, which is Sphagnum medium, which is one of 2 species which were formerly classified as Magellanicum, if anyone knows that one. And then the smaller weedy one is Capillifolium. So Sphagnum medium tends to be found in areas which are more highly acidic with really high water levels. and very low levels of available nutrients. And it kind of occupies a space within the microtopography, which is halfway between the hummock, the really tall hummock, and the really low hollow. And both of these species here are what have been called in the past the key peat forming species, and they're species which tend to be found in reasonably good conditioned peat, especially sphagnum medium, which is quite typical of a raised bog or a very stable community. Now, the opposite of that on the far right, this kind of yellowish species here is sphagnum phallax. And actually up on the top left of this picture on the far right as well, we can see sphagnum fimbriatum, which was the one which was on the previous slide. And sphagnum phallax is typical of a somewhat more disturbed system. So it still likes a fairly high water level, but it is able to cope with the more variable conditions and a more variable level of nutrient availability as well. And this is often seen in areas where you're looking at the landscape post-fire or post-disturbance. This species will be present quite often. So you can see that depending on which species you find where, it can give you a clue as to what kind of overall habitat you're looking at and a bit of a clue towards the history of the area. So vascular plants, the higher plants which you find within the peatland habitat, you tend to find heather-like shrubs, you find a diversity of sedges and also graminoid species, so grasses as well. And these species also show a range of adaptations to deal with high water levels within the system, because it's not really a very friendly system for plants to grow in. These include tussock formation, so you get plants like purple moorgrass, Molinia, which exhibit tussock formation, and that raises the plant slightly above the water level. And then you also get really shallow root systems on some plants, which just hold the roots above the anoxic zone of the peat. Or in some plants like the hare's tail cottongrass, you get roots which can tolerate extended periods in with areas with low oxygen and in really high water conditions. You also get, in some cases, floating mats of vegetation, which can form between the sphagnum and the rhizome, so part of the root system of the other species. This is what would be used to form kind of the quaking mires, which are quite common in some of the Scandinavian peatlands, which is effectively a mat of floating vegetation over a body of water, which then fills up over time. And we also get carnivorous plants found in our peatland habitats where there's low nutrient conditions or where there's low nitrogen content of the soil. This is supplemented then by the prey species which they catch. In the UK, Drosera species tend to be the major component of the carnivorous plant species. We have these on our sites. They're always exciting to find. And then this picture on the right here is the club moss, which we found in our Cymru habitat restoration area. So moving on then to fungi, which are really key to the peat ecosystem because they're the major nutrient cyclers within the peat, and they're able to cope far better in really low nutrient habitats than bacteria are. And what we actually see is gradation sometimes between the different characters of peat. So where you have fen peat, which can have a slightly higher nutrient content and maybe a slightly less acidic overall quality to the area, you'd find a higher percentage of bacteria which provide the kind of nutrient cycling compared to fungi. There are two main groups of fungi which dominate the kind of peat fungal community. These are the Ascomycota and the Basidiomycota. And the fungal diversity changes dependent sometimes on the dominant vegetation within the area. So what we've seen with the introduction of coniferous woodland to some of our peat bodies is this then leads to a presence of fungi which are decidedly atypical. You know, this on the right, I think, is a russula species which we found on one of our habitat restoration areas, and this kind of grows in close association with the conifers, and we haven't really found it so much in our areas of open peat. So that pretty much covers the vegetation. I'm going to hand over to Mike, who's going to go through some of the peatland fauna that you might find.
Thanks, Joey. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the characteristic animals associated with peatland, and then really talk about the fauna associated with our sites a bit more in depth. So peatlands are very important habitat for a variety of different species, and especially blanket bog areas. We have a unique breeding bird assemblage, and they really have an international importance for a number of iconic breeding UK species, such as golden plover and greenshank, curlew, red-throated diver, dunlin, common scoter, and these birds are really associated with large areas of open habitat that kind of blanket bog provides. Some key areas for these species are in Caithness and Sutherland, in the Flows country in Scotland. Other species associated with these kind of habitats can be red grouse, more associated with marginal habitats around bogs perhaps, and black grouse, similar kind of habitats, and raptors, breeding raptors such as hen harrier and short-eared owl. These habitats are also key for a number of other different species, so invertebrate assemblages can be really rich, especially for families that respond to small-scale structural variation in vegetation, so that kind of microtopography that Joey was talking about, ridges and furrows and hollows. And invertebrates on blanket bog also play a key role in fragmenting the plant litter and aid in the peat accumulation process. So the peatlands are a really important habitat for a number of different species, but really the nature of the fauna associated with our peatland habitats in southeast Wales or South Wales has been massively and fundamentally changed through the afforestation that happened in the 1950s and 60s. So those species that require the large open expanses of habitat, such as breeding waders and probably raptors such as short-eared owl and hen harrier, that may have been present, probably were, have been lost and replaced with other species that can use the habitats that are now present. So this matrix of woodland and open areas around remnant bog features, fringed with bits of dry heath and wet heath and the freeze along the slopes. So we've lost some of these breeding wader species, but gained species such as goshawk and honey buzzard. And then also there are species that are able to utilize the marginal habitats and open areas within the forest matrix and have persisted in the area. So we got important populations of nightjar. So these are the photos on the slides you can see actually. So you got nightjar, watervole on the far left, and nightjar, and the next one, and then adder and emperor moth. So emperor moth is one of the largest UK moth species, and always a pleasure to find. So if we move on to the next slide then, Joey, I'll talk a little bit more about some of these species that are characteristic of the South Wales peatlands in our area. So the first species we'll talk about is European nightjar. And these are a trans-Sahara migratory bird species, mostly associated with dry heath habitat in the southeast, or traditionally associated with dry heath habitat in the southeast of England and Dorset and those kind of areas. But really colonised our uplands, or sought to have colonised our uplands in South Wales, associated with afforestation works when large amount of felling took place. They're really a bird of needs open ground and bare ground to nest on. Although they were traditionally associated with heathland habitats in Gower, Pembrokeshire and Llyn, they have now really taken to these upland conifer habitats, where we find dry heath developing. So they nest on the floor on bare ground, lay 2 eggs, and they really rely on camouflage to avoid nest predation and avoid people. Their strategy really is to sit there and try and look like a stick. They feed on moths, so they're mostly nocturnal or crepuscular, so they're active at dusk and dawn, and they leave the nest to and forage, well, depending on the habitat quality, either in close proximity to the nest, within a couple of kilometres, or in some cases, many kilometres from the nest. And as I said, they feed on moths, and they've got a really distinctive song. And I did try and put a file in of the song, so I'm not sure if anyone can hear this, whether it's playing or not. But it's a chirring noise that is really distinctive. I mean, there's nothing really else quite like it. And if you go up onto some of these tops around Hendra Mynydd and those kind of areas, you'll hear nightjar chirring, and they'll be back on the breeding territories at the moment actually, and looking to initiate nest development and lay in very shortly. So they really are a great species. and really characteristic of our area these days, with our project area really supporting a very important population. If we can move on to the next slide then, Joey. So that this slide shows European water vole, or also ratty from Wind in the Willows, for those who remember that. And one of the early really interesting findings from our project area was that there's a remnant, or perhaps remnant population of European water vole across the upland plateau here. And in Britain, water voles tend to live in burrows excavated along the banks of rivers, ditches, ponds and streams, and they were often thought of as a lowland species. But in recent years and decades, they've been found in upland blanket bog habitat in Scotland, up to 1,000 meters above sea level, and now in the Lost Peatlands area across the plateau. They tend to prefer lush riparian vegetation, which provides cover for them, but also the food they eat. They're vegetarian. They eat rushes and sedges and other species. And they live in burrows along the bank, and they tend to only live for about 5 months in total. And their population really expands and contracts with the season, with the population moving out and spreading across areas during the summer months as they breed and go through breeding cycles, and then really dying back and contracting to core areas during the winter. And the water vole population in the UK was severely impacted through mink predation, and this may have been one of the factors in driving them into these upland habitats where mink were a much lower population density. But yeah, as I was saying, there's an important population of this species present on a number of our sites. And then if we can go to the next slide, Joey, another characteristic species of more heathland, but still present in our areas in good numbers, is European adder. This is one of the UK's only venomous snakes, and can be spotted basking in sunshine generally on heathlands. And in our project area, they tend to be found around the margins, around some of the drier habitats, but they certainly will use some of the bog habitats for foraging. They hunt lizards and small mammals, and will also take ground nesting birds such as skylark, meadow pipit, but also nightjar chicks and eggs occasionally. In spring, the male adders perform a dance in which they duel and fend off competing males. And they give birth to live young. So the females incubate the eggs internally and give birth to 3 to 20 young. And they hibernate from October through the winter months to March. They tend to hibernate in underground features, but things like wooded banks or old stone walls, things with thermally stable temperatures where they're unlikely to go below zero, but they keep a stable temperature throughout the winter period of cool but not below zero freezing conditions. And they're sadly massively reduced in population size, and are currently thought to be under serious threat. And quite often deliberate persecution is implicated in this, so people actually going out and attacking adders, which is really sad to see, because they really are quite a special species. Now, if we can go on to the next slide then, Joey, I'll just do a very brief little bit on invertebrates and Mae'r habitats. I mean, this deserves really a talk all of its own. I mean, Mae'r habitats can support a huge variety of rare, notable invertebrate species, really driven by the low nutrient availability and specialist habitats the sites support, also supporting specialist invertebrate species. So examples of this would be large heath butterfly, Mae'r pill beetle, or horse minor moth. And this is just a video on the right of your screen there showing some of the specialist dragonfly species that we found on some of our sites, actually, with black dart laying eggs at the Castell Nos HRA there. And black dart is a small narrow-bodied dragonfly that's really on the wing from June to October, so they'll be emerging very shortly, really. And this video was taken in September last year during some of the site survey work at Castell Nos. And you see the eggs are laid in flight by dipping the abdomen into the water, and these eggs then hatch the following spring, and the larvae develop really very rapidly and emerging in as little as 2 months' time, really. And as the name suggests, really, they're skittish and darting aerial predator, moving suddenly from position to position, catching prey in flight. And that's really all I'm going to say on invertebrates at the moment. So I think we'll go on to the next slide then, Joey. Great, yeah. So this is now moving on to some of the discussions about what we might be doing with the project moving forward, or what our plans are associated around peatland restoration. And that the real aims of the project are to try and restore the hydrological functioning of the peatlands. So as Joey was talking about earlier on, with needing a high water level within the soil to reduce vegetational decomposition. This is being inhibited through draining of the peat, and a lot of this draining was undertaken to aid forest growth, basically to increase the productivity of the trees planted on the sites. So during planting, they used large ploughs to put in drainage channels, and this has lowered the water table within the peat, and increased the productivity of the woodland, but also caused a lower water table in the peat that increases oxidation and decomposition and loss of carbon in the long term. So our project really is aimed at restoring the water level, and this might be through blocking these drainage channels up, filling them up, or completely removing them. The first step though is to take the trees off. So the first step will be taking trees off, and then looking to restore the hydrological functioning of the peatlands, and then hopefully that will in turn restore the ecological functioning of the peatlands. So we'll start to develop more characteristic peatland habitats, and then in the long term potentially peatland fauna as well. I don't know, Joey, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I can just say a bit about why this picture was chosen for this slide. And I think what this picture does quite nicely is illustrate some of the challenges that we are going to face through our peatland restoration. So like you said, Mike, we've got a ditch running straight down the middle of this picture here, and that's taking water off our site. It's eroding some of the peat, but it's also leaving this very steep edge, which is then subject to even more drying and erosion through wind action. And you can see the depth of the channel. There's Mike's legs just up in the top left-hand corner there. So you can see the depth of peat that we have, but also some of the challenges that we're going to have and the damage that can be caused by drainage. As well as that, we've got a really atypical vegetation. There's no bog vegetation here. There's nothing that's going to, successfully lead to peat formation within the short term. And then, like you said, there's trees on the site, which are another challenge that we have to face. So the next few pictures that we've got, they're just going to run through some of the things that we can do to kind of mend some of these things that have happened to the peatland in the past. So we've got two kinds of ditch blocks here. We've got a plastic dam on the left. This is at Cors Faulkner, which is a raised bog near Aberystwyth. And then on the right, we've got timber dams, which were put in this past winter at Mynydd Maen near Cwmbran. The plastic piling was put in over the winter of 2004 to 2005, and you can see the water that's held back, but you can also see the level of revegetation that's occurred compared to the timber dams that were put in very recently, where there's a lot of water being held back. So that's succeeding in raising the water table within the ditch, but the vegetation hasn't quite got a chance to grab hold yet and kind of recolonize some of the area where it had been lost from before. So another way we can stop water loss from our peatlands is through bunding. These are effectively dams that are made out of the peat, and you can see them stretching across the landscape here from left to right. This picture was taken at Mynydd Ton, which is fairly close to our project area. This work was done by NRW very recently, and you can see almost straight away the level of water which is then held back by the bunds, and then this succeeds again in raising the water table and creating a wetter environment for the more typical peatland species to re-establish. This is a technique that's been used on a large range of different peatland habitats. This is a more upland habitat on kind of a more blanket bog, but it has been used quite successfully as well in lowland raised bogs. particular
Yeah, I think
coarse cannon.
this funding at Mawndiroedd is the first time it's actually been tried at upland blanket bog habitat. So it'll be really interesting to see how this develops.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, it will be. Do you have anything you want to say about banding, Mike?
No. It's just as I was saying that this is the first time this intervention has been tried in an upland habitat. It's been tried very successfully in lowland raised bog, in the Solwig first kind of area, and on some of the Welsh raised bogs. But on an upland blanket bog, such as this here in Mae'r, which is just above Clydach Vale and Tom Pentra, those kind of areas. This is the first time it's been tried. So this is some experimental techniques, and it'll be interesting to see how this develops. And NRW have got some good monitoring in place to look at the water levels there, and we'll see what happens with that.
Okay, great. We're going to move on to a different one to manage a slightly different challenge. So this is reprofiling of a really steep peak cliff. There's again a Mae'r main common. So you can see on the left-hand picture here, there's a peak cliff of a really exposed steep face. This is about 1 meter, and it's just going to continue drying and continue eroding back through. You know, when peat gets dry, it's almost like dust, and it can just be blown away with the wind, and the peat body will just recede over time, leaving more and more kind of exposed area. So what you can do is you can come along with a digger that you can see here. This digger was on wide tracks to prevent it falling into the peat, and you can take off this top layer of vegetation and just regrade the slope to a much shallower kind of gradient, and then this stops some of the erosion. You put the vegetation back on top that you took off to start with, and then this can really lessen the erosion and also help to raise the water table within that peat body. So this work was done again over the past winter, and it'll be really interesting to see how this affects the overall character of the peatland.
Yeah, and this erosion and kind of cliff features is something we see quite often on our sites, and it's clear from the forestry layout actually and the drainage channels that these features on our sites were pre-planted. So our peatlands in the upland areas were eroding prior to the afforestation works in the 1950s and 1960s. And in some cases, it looks likely that the afforestation perhaps reduced the erosion of these features through perhaps, I don't know, creating a more humid environment or just blocking the effects of the erosional wind or water on these cliff faces. And where we find them now, they're not as unvegetated as in that left-hand picture there. They tend to be vegetated steep slopes, but they're evident across all three of our habitat restoration areas, with some really big cliffs on the, well, big in terms of peak cliffs, so 1.5 meters or so on the Cymru.
So the last one we're going to cover is again, it's a bit more of a less known restoration method. It's known as ground smoothing, and really it's a specialism from the forest to bog restoration, where you're taking something which has been previously afforested. You can see in the pictures here we've got coniferous woodland on this peatland, and you're trying to turn it back to a more natural habitat. And what this involves is, again, coming in with heavy machinery, and where you have the stumps in the ridge furrow topography that's left over from planting and then felling the woodland. You're flipping the stumps over, and you're pushing them down into the peat to try and leave the area with this nice flat kind of single plane, which can then revegetate naturally. And then you can see this was taken less than 10 minutes after this ground smoothing occurred in the left-hand picture, and you see the water table is already so high that there is pooling water on the surface. And then a right-hand picture, this is 10 years post ground smoothing, same wind farm location, just a different plot, and you can see the revegetation that's occurred. There is still some brash present, but the overall condition of the area has improved amazingly. Mike, do you have anything to say about ground smoothing? I mean, it's a technique that we're going to have to be using on our sites a lot, where there's coniferous woodland left.
Yeah, the evidence base for restoring afforested peatland to active bog is really sparse. I mean, it's not been done many places, and where it has been done, it's fairly recent. So the results are still unknown. But this is an approach that shows a lot of promise, and has been widely applied in Scotland, and is been adapted as really the go-to solution for Scotland. And it's approach we have trialled on some of our sites, and we will be trialling going forward, and likely to form a bulk of some of the restoration, at least where we're on deep peat.
Okay, great. Well, that brings our talk to an end. I've just got up the timetable here for the rest of the talks so that people can see what there is, if there's anything that interests you. I highly encourage you to join in, and if you want to get involved with the project in any way, or follow our progress, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Lost Peatlands. The details for myself and Mike are up there as well. And then if you have any questions or anything you want to know, we're always reachable by email as well. To do with the project, there's our emails down the bottom of the screen. So what I'll do now is I'll stop sharing the presentation, and we'll just go back to the regular Zoom room, I suppose, and then we'll run through any questions that anyone has there. So thank you very much for listening.
We had one question pop up during our talks from Kate Jenkins. She's asked, are you monitoring hydrology, the impact on flood flows and low water flows in catchment downstream to quantify ecosystem services?
Yeah, I can perhaps give some information on that. Yes, we are not across all our sites, but we've picked a test catchment where we've put in some hydrological monitoring works. We'll be looking at flow monitoring in one of the catchments in the Upper Rhondda area. Who owns the land? Is that? Yeah. So the land we're operating on is all owned by Welsh Government. So it's part of the Welsh Government woodland estate, and it's managed by Natural Resources Wales for forestry. There's another question there from Kate Jenkins. Have you looked at using heather bales to block grips? Yeah, I mean, we're aware of heather bales as a solution for blocking grips. And yeah, we potentially may use them on some of our areas. The issue we've got on our sites is really the previously afforested, or the afforestation has changed the topography of the site. And that this has created a ridge and furrow kind of topography, or micro topography, and to get a more classic peatland, high water table consistent through an area, we need to really level that out. So if we're going to do that, it's kind of more efficient if we just fill in grips in their entirety, because we'll need to take large machinery on site to create that level topography anyway. So blocking grips with any other material, wood or heather bales, or any of the other kind of approaches, is more likely to happen where we're not going to use that ground smoothing approach. So perhaps along the peripheries where we've got slightly shallower peat, maybe. Don't know. Have you got anything else to add on that, Joey?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered it pretty well. I mean, I think the difference between using a traditional grip blocking and what we have to do here is that we are dealing with a situation where rather than a few main drains going through, there's a change in topography every 1.5 to 2 meters. So to really get an effective restoration, you do need to use the ground smoothing to level out the ground into a much more flat plane. But then if we do have some of the larger forestry drains that were put in, heather bales are always an option, along with the other ditch blocking measures that we covered.
Okay, and then there's another question from Vicky Mill. Is it mostly areas which are no longer financially viable for conifer plantations? I don't know. So our habitat restoration areas that we are dealing with were prioritised by NRW and during our early discussions with them as priority restoration sites, and that was mostly driven by the knowledge or pre-existing knowledge of where the peat is likely to be on the woodland estate. But I suppose conversely, the areas where they've got deep peat are also where the trees don't grow as well generally. So yeah, are less likely to be financially viable for forestry in the long term.
Okay guys, we're coming to the end of our talk now, so it doesn't appear like there's any more questions. So If everyone wants to unmute to thank Mike and Joey for an awesome talk, that would be great. If not, we hope we see you at some future talks. And thank you very much, Mike and Joey. It really was an interesting talk.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, guys. That was brilliant.